Jennifer, I'll be sure we'll fire the graphics person for that day 4 because we're actually
Yeah.
into week 2. It is day
Nice.
6 of the trial.
Yeah.
But I will be sure to show our graphics person the door at the end of the show. Um,
Yeah.
I know that you're bringing us this story tonight, so I will turn it over to you.
It's not really a story, but more of a recap of today's events. If you guys didn't have the opportunity to watch or couldn't stomach it, don't worry. I watched it for you and I was nauseated the entire time. So there's some really pivotal testimony that happened today. Of course, this is the beginning of week 2, day 6 of the trial. And so we have the doctor that attempted to treat George Floyd at the hospital, who testified that George Floyd had been in cardiac arrest for at least 30 minutes by the time he reached the hospital. They finally called his death at 60 minutes. They tried to revive him for 30 minutes to no avail. And so the prosecutor kind of, asked him what the cause of death was. They were like, "Do you think it was drugs?" And they're like, "No, he didn't show any sign of kind of agitation that you would expect with drugs. Of course, he was in cardiac arrest the entire time, but they had no reason to believe that had anything to do with anything he had taken, but rather the probable cause was what they call hypoxia due to asphyxiation, which was basically the result of having someone hold their knee on his neck for 9 minutes, Derek Chauvin. So this was a really fundamental piece of testimony here. We also had the Minneapolis police chief testify, and he testified, much to the chagrin of the defense attorney, that this was not a standard restraint technique, that he felt this was far too excessive. The defense attorney tried to show a 5-second clip right when the EMTs had arrived, where Chauvin had actually moved his knee off of George Floyd's neck down to his shoulder blade area, and then tried to use that as a way in which to challenge the fact that Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck for that particular amount of time. But the police chief came back and said this was the only time that he'd actually seen the movement from the neck to the shoulder blade region was when the EMTs had arrived. He also testified, which made me super, super nauseous, that about 7 minutes or so into the video, he actually believed George Floyd to be dead. He didn't know if he was any longer alive. And that was 2+ minutes before Derek Chauvin actually removed his knee from his neck. They also got testimony from one of the inspectors, who's actually an instructor for the training for Minneapolis, the different kinds of training that they go through yearly, I believe, annual training. And restraint is one of them, because restraint was one of the big topics. There was 3 hours of testimony from the police chief. And so what really got me too in that 3 hours of testimony is what they call the MRT, and it's like the maximum restraint technique. And so what they were talking about was hobbling, and it's basically honestly, hobbling is what they do to restrain livestock. So it's basically restraining hands and then pulling an ankle up to like the waist area and restraining that. They talked about that as a maximum restraint technique, the challenges of using the maximum restraint technique in the moment. The police chief testified that this was not, to his understanding, an approved restraint technique. The neck, they were allowed to use an arm, was kind of his understanding, but never a knee. And so he didn't understand what kind of restraint technique this was. Neither did the inspector. So this was a big point of contestation. But also when the inspector who does the training came up and was like, "I don't even know what kind of technique he was attempting to use here. This is not something we teach." He basically challenged her as an educator, saying, "Well, maybe you were using outdated material," because they were forced to turn over, I think, around 30,000 pages of educational material. So there was, I mean, it is, it's a necessary thing to watch because it is so important, but it's so disturbing. I can't imagine even having to witness that. The testimony is just absolutely disturbing. And I was like sick for a majority of the day. It's that bad. So I don't know what's going to come of this. During the mid-afternoon break, they actually had like a police conference talking about what's kind of security they have in place to prevent violent protests, because there's been a lot of what they consider to be peaceful protests. And so they want to keep them peaceful so the court can get through and do its job. But they're talking about bringing in potentially reinforcements as the trial nears an end. And it's just concerning to listen to the analysis of the trial, because it's so clear that he murdered this man, that Derek Chauvin is a murderer and he murdered George Floyd. But there are so many technicalities, and it only takes one juror to say, well, reasonable doubt, I don't believe he actually intended to kill him. Because what the defense is doing right now is trying to build a case that, yeah, maybe what he did was unethical, but it wasn't criminal.
Yeah, and that's what I've said. All it takes is one juror to have reasonable doubt, and Derek Chauvin's going to walk. Jennifer, we have a clip of the testimony from the police chief. Do we want to go ahead? You've got a great summary, and thank you so much. Do you want us to roll that clip for you?
Yeah, if you want to. Sorry, I totally forgot about those. I was like so in.
No.
Say.
We'll go ahead and roll the clip.
Okay.
Do you believe that the defendant followed departmental policy 5-304 regarding de-escalation?
I absolutely do not agree with that.
And how so?
That action is not de-escalation. And when we talk about the framework of our sanctity of life, and when we talk about the principles and values that we have, that action goes contrary to what we're taught.
As you reflect on Exhibit 17, I must ask you, is this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
Well, we read the departmental policy on neck restraints. Is this a neck restraint?
The conscious neck restraint by policy mentions light to moderate pressure. When I look at Exhibit 17, and when I look at the facial expression of Mr. Floyd, that does not appear in any way, shape, or form that is light to moderate pressure.
So is it your belief then that this particular form of restraint, if that's what we'll call it, in fact violates departmental policy?
I absolutely agree that violates our policy.
It's really damning testimony.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there, yeah, like I said, he sat for 3 hours, and they're basically got into a lot of disputes over what constitutes excessive force and restraint in the moment. He also tried to, the defense attorney, Eric, I can't remember his last name. I don't really care to be quite honest. He was basically trying to make a case too that the crowd was creating a crisis, and that they felt that the crisis was larger than it actually was. It was actually really disgusting. That was the point in time when I was messaging you asking how can he live with himself. So yeah, there was some, it's so very difficult to listen to. Again, it's necessary. I mean, this is a big moment, but all of this is, it's very difficult to stomach. And that picture, he doesn't even look like remotely, I don't know, remorseful or disturbed or anything about the fact that he is pressing all of his weight, and he is not a small man, on somebody's neck with his knee. A restrained man to boot.
It started a movement around the world, protests in 650 U.S. cities.
Yeah.
That continues today in many locations. We'll do another update, Jennifer, on Wednesday.
Okay.
And with that, we'll do a little pause for the cause, and we'll go into our next story.